April 7, 1945, 06:23 hours, 28,000 feet above Okinawa. Lieutenant Junior Grade Kanayoshi Muto had been flying the Mitsubishi A6M50 for 19 months. Through the crystal-clear morning air, he spotted 8 American fighters climbing toward his formation from below. The inverted gull wings were unmistakable, Vought F4U Corsairs. Muto smiled behind his oxygen mask. The Corsair was fast in a straight line, but it was also heavy, nearly double the Zero's weight. The Zero weighed 5,200 pounds empty. The Corsair weighed 8,900 pounds. Survivability made you slow, and the Americans had chosen armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks over performance. All aircraft, prepare for combat, Muto transmitted to his 16 Zeros. We will use altitude advantage and superior climb rate. Standard tactics: dive on the enemy from above. Use speed from the dive to climb back faster than the heavier American fighters could follow. It had worked against F-6F Hellcats and P-38 Lightnings. Muto rolled into a dive, his formation following. They screamed down at over 400 miles per hour. The Corsairs split, half left, half right. Muto followed the left group, lining up on the trailing Corsair. Range 300 meters. Then the Corsairs pulled into a vertical climb. Not a gradual climb, a pure vertical climb, straight up from 24,000 feet after maneuvering. Muto followed, pulling back hard. The Zero's nose came up. Airspeed bled off. 380 knots, 320, 280. At 240 knots, the controls felt mushy. At 200 knots, the Zero could barely maintain the climb. Above him, the Corsairs continued climbing vertically. Muto's Zero shuddered. He had to push the nose down or stall. As he did, he watched the Corsairs climb another 2,000 feet straight up, then roll inverted and dive back down on his formation from above. The altitude advantage had reversed. In 15 seconds, the Americans had climbed from below to above. Muto's ambush had become a trap. The first burst of .50 caliber fire tore through his wingman's Zero, shredding the unarmored fuselage. It exploded as unprotected fuel tanks ignited. Muto threw his Zero into maximum performance right turn. The Corsair followed, then started climbing while still turning. The American fighter climbed 1,500 feet while completing a 360-degree turn, emerging above and behind Muto. Physics said this was impossible. You couldn't climb and turn simultaneously without bleeding all energy. The Zero couldn't do it. No fighter could. Except the Corsair could. 6.50 caliber machine guns fired simultaneously. Muto's Zero broke apart, its lightweight structure unable to withstand the hammer blows. Of 16 Zeros, 12 were destroyed in 4 minutes. The Corsairs lost nothing. The combat report filed by Lieutenant Commander Roger Hedrick, VF-84, stated, "Enemy fighters attempted to use altitude advantage. Corsairs outclimbed Zeros by approximately 3,000 feet, reversed altitude advantage, destroyed enemy formation from above. The secret wasn't skill or tactics, it was 2,000 horsepower." In 1938, Rex Beisel, Vought's chief engineer, proposed installing the most powerful engine available, the Pratt and Whitney R2800 double Wasp, generating 2,000 horsepower in the lightest practical airframe. The R2800 was an engineering marvel. 18 cylinders in 2 rows, displacing 2,804 cubic inches, producing 2,000 horsepower at takeoff and maintaining 1,650 horsepower at 21,000 feet through a 2-stage supercharger. The Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine produced 940 horsepower at takeoff, dropping to 660 horsepower at 21,000 feet. The Corsair had 3 times the power at high altitude. The enormous propeller required to absorb 2,000 horsepower, 13 feet, 4 inches diameter, couldn't fit with conventional landing gear on carriers. Basil's solution, the inverted gull wing, angling down from the fuselage then back up toward the wingtips, creating space for short landing gear while maintaining propeller clearance. The resulting aircraft specifications: length 33 feet, 4 inches, wingspan 41 feet, empty weight 8,982 pounds, Maximum takeoff weight 14,000 pounds. Wing area 314 square feet. Compare to 0. Length 29 feet 9 inches. Wingspan 39 feet 4 inches. Empty weight 5,209 pounds. Maximum takeoff weight 6,164 pounds. Wing area 229 square feet. The Corsair used more material than two Zeros combined. It seemed impossible such a beast could match the Zero's agility. It didn't match the Zero's agility. It exceeded the Zero's climb rate by such a margin that agility became irrelevant. An aircraft climbs by, pointing its nose up and using engine power to overcome gravity. Climb rate depends on excess power. Power available minus power required. Japanese engineers understood superchargers and had developed single-stage units, but never an effective two-stage system. A two-stage supercharger required precision-machined impellers with thousandths of an inch tolerances, high-temperature alloys withstanding 300 degrees Fahrenheit plus compression heating, complex intercoolers, sophisticated automatic controls, and extensive testing. Japan's stretched industrial capacity couldn't divert resources from immediate production. Pratt and Whitney's Connecticut factories employed 36,000 workers by 1943, dedicated solely to engine production. They could afford to spend millions developing advanced superchargers because they had resources to develop and produce simultaneously. February 13, 1943. The F4U Corsair entered combat with VMF-124, a Marine Corps squadron, at Guadalcanal. On February 14th, the squadron encountered Zeros escorting bombers over Bougainville. Lieutenant Ken Walsh led 4 Corsairs against 12 Zeros. Walsh's after-action report: engaged enemy fighters at 18,000 feet. Enemy attempted to climb above our formation. Corsairs followed in climb. We outclimbed enemy fighters by substantial margin, achieving altitude advantage within 90 seconds. Rolled into attack from above. Enemy fighters attempted to evade through turning maneuvers. Corsair turning radius is inferior to Zero at low speeds, but superior diving speed allowed us to disengage and re-attack at will. When enemy fighters attempted escape through climbing turns, Corsairs followed easily. Enemy climb rate is inadequate to escape Corsair at any altitude. Result: 6 enemy fighters destroyed, 0 Corsairs lost. Walsh became a leading ace with 21 kills. His tactics became standard doctrine: use superior climb rate to gain altitude advantage, attack from above, and if the enemy evades, climb back up faster than they can follow. A captured Japanese intelligence report from March 1943 stated, "The new American fighter, type F4U, demonstrates climb performance exceeding our estimates. Previous intelligence suggested American fighters were optimized for level speed at expense of climb rate. This does not apply to F4U. Pilots report F4U can match or exceed 0 climb rate at medium altitudes and significantly exceed 0 climb rate above 20,000 feet. Conventional tactics of using altitude advantage and climb performance are ineffective. Recommend: avoid combat above 15,000 feet where F4U demonstrates maximum superiority. Engage only when numerical advantage is significant." The Japanese, who dominated Pacific air combat through superior climb and altitude performance, were now telling pilots to avoid high-altitude combat and only engage with numerical superiority. Overall, Corsair combat statistics 1943 to 1945. Total Corsairs lost in combat 189. Total enemy aircraft destroyed by Corsairs 2,140. Kill ratio 11.3 to 1. This is the highest kill ratio of any American fighter in World War II, including the P-51 Mustang at approximately 5 to 1, versus A6M0. Corsairs lost 74, Zeros destroyed 1,189, kill ratio 16 to 1, versus Kai 43, Oscar. Corsairs lost 31, Oscars destroyed 356, kill ratio 11.5 to 1, versus Kai 61, Tony. Corsairs lost 42, Tonys destroyed 298, kill ratio 7.1 to 1, versus J2M Raiden. Corsairs lost 28, Rydens destroyed 156, kill ratio 5.6 to 1. Post-war analysis cross-referencing American and Japanese records confirms these numbers. Japanese units facing Corsairs suffered catastrophic losses. The 201st Kokutai, an elite fighter unit, engaged Marine Corsair squadrons over Rabaul in November 1943. Over 6 weeks, 201st Kokutai losses 42 aircraft, 38 pilots killed in action. Opposing Marine Corsair squadrons, 6 aircraft lost, 2 pilots KIA. A 7-to-1 loss ratio that destroyed the 201st as an effective unit. Saburo Sakai, Japan's third-ranking ace with 64 victories, described the Corsair in his memoir, Samurai. The F4U was the finest fighter in the Pacific. We called it Whistling Death because of the sound its air intakes made during a dive. Against the Zero, the Corsair pilot had every advantage except maneuverability at low speeds. But he didn't need to turn fight. He would climb above you, dive on you at high speed, and if you evaded, he would climb back up faster than you could follow. You couldn't escape by climbing. You couldn't escape by diving. The Corsair was faster. Your only chance was to see him first and dive away before he saw you. Fighting a Corsair was like fighting a tiger. Better to avoid it entirely. Yasuhiko Kuroe, a Zero pilot who survived multiple Corsair encounters. American pilots in Corsairs fought with absolute confidence. They would climb directly toward us, even when we had altitude advantage, because they knew they would outclimb us. Our tactics depended on maintaining altitude advantage. The Corsair made this impossible. I once saw Corsairs climb from 15,000 feet to 28,000 feet in less than 4 minutes. By the time they reached our altitude, we were out of position and vulnerable. The worst part was hopelessness. In a Zero, you could outturn anything. But turning doesn't help when the enemy can climb away, reposition, and attack again before you can follow. Engine power. Corsair. 2,000 horsepower at sea level. 1,650 horsepower at 20,000 feet. Zero 940 horsepower at sea level. 660 horsepower at 20,000 feet. Corsair has 2.1 times power at sea level, 2.5 times power at 20,000 feet. Wing loading, Corsair 38.2 pounds per square foot, Zero 26.9 pounds per square foot. Zero has lower wing loading, better maneuverability. Power loading, Corsair 6.0 pounds per horsepower, Zero 6.6 pounds per horsepower. Slight edge to Corsair. Maximum speed, Corsair 417 miles per hour at 19,900 feet. Zero 351 miles per hour at 19,685 feet. Corsair is 66 miles per hour faster. Climb rate at sea level. Corsair 3,120 feet per minute. Zero 3,150 feet per minute, nearly identical. Climb rate at 20,000 feet. Corsair 2,880 feet per minute. Zero 1,450 feet per minute. Corsair climbs 98.6% faster, nearly double. Service ceiling. Corsair 37,000 feet, Zero 33,000 feet. Corsair can fight 4,000 feet higher. Turn radius at 200 miles per hour. Corsair 1,350 feet, Zero 950 feet. Zero turns 42% tighter. Roll rate. Corsair 110 degrees per second, Zero 60 degrees per second. Corsair rolls 83% faster. The Zero was more maneuverable in horizontal turns, but the Corsair was faster, climbed better at altitude, rolled faster, and operated at higher altitudes. In slow speed, low-altitude turning fights, the Zero would win. Corsair pilots didn't fight at slow speeds and low altitudes. They fought fast, high, and vertical. By mid-1943, Corsair squadrons employed boom and zoom tactics, climb to altitude advantage using superior climb rate, typically 25,000 to 30,000 feet, patrolling 3,000 to 5,000 feet above expected enemy altitude. Identify and attack. Dive on enemy from above at high speed, achieving 400+ miles per hour. Fire burst at close range 200 to 300 feet. Do not turn fight. Extend and climb. If target destroyed, climb back to altitude. If target evaded, use speed from dive to zoom climb past enemy. Climb rate advantage means enemy cannot follow. Reposition for another attack. Repeat, multiple attack runs from different angles. Enemy cannot escape by climbing. Enemy cannot pursue effectively. Eventually, enemy runs out of altitude, speed, or luck. This became yo-yo tactics: dive, attack, zoom climb, repeat. Japanese pilots had no effective counter. Their standard tactic, turn into the attacker and use superior maneuverability, didn't work because the Corsair wouldn't stay in the turn. It would zoom, climb away, then come back with altitude advantage restored. Trying to outclimb the Corsair was futile. Trying to escape by diving was equally futile. The Corsair was faster in a dive and could follow, then use superior power to pull out and climb back up. The only effective Japanese tactic was numerical superiority. A 4-plane division of Zeros might engage 2 Corsairs by overwhelming with numbers, but losses were heavy. A captured Japanese tactical manual from late 1944. When encountering F4U aircraft, avoid engagement unless numerical superiority exceeds 4-1. If engagement unavoidable, attempt to force combat below 10,000 feet where F4U altitude advantage is minimized. This was a doctrine of avoidance, not engagement. Initial carrier landing trials in 1942 revealed serious problems. The Corsair's long nose blocked forward view during carrier approach. Pilots had to fly curved approaches, looking out the side window, then straighten at the last second, extremely dangerous on a pitching carrier deck. The Corsair would stall suddenly without warning at low speeds, dropping a wing violently. At 85 to 90 miles per hour approach speeds, this was catastrophic. The main landing gear's stiff oleo struts caused bouncing on touchdown, meaning missed arresting wires and potential barrier crashes or going overboard. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics initially rejected the Corsair for carrier operations as unsuitable for shipboard use. The aircraft was relegated to Marine Corps land-based squadrons. This should have killed the program. Carrier fighters were the Navy's priority. But Marine combat results were too impressive. By late 1943, Marine Corsair squadrons achieved kill ratios exceeding 10-1. The Navy reconsidered. Vought engineers solved the problems. Raised pilot seats 6 inches with bubble canopy improved forward visibility. A small pneumatic spoiler on the wing leading edge vibrated the control stick before stall, giving warning to reduce angle of attack. Landing gear oleo struts were softened and extended 6 inches, reducing bounce and improving ground handling. These modifications created the F4U-1A variant, entering carrier operations in December 1944, nearly 2 years after first. Combat missions. The delay was costly. For 2 years, Navy carrier squadrons flew F-6F Hellcats, while the superior Corsair was restricted to land bases. By 1945, both Navy and Marine squadrons operated Corsairs from carriers. The most famous Corsair unit was VMF-214, the Black Sheep Squadron commanded by Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington. Boyington was 31, ancient by fighter pilot standards, when he took command in September 1943. He'd flown with the Flying Tigers in China, scoring 6 victories. Now he commanded replacement pilots, misfits, and troublemakers nobody wanted. He turned them into the highest-scoring Marine fighter squadron of the war. Operating from forward bases in the Solomons, VMF-214 flew Corsairs against Japanese forces defending Rabaul. Over 84 days, flew 804 combat missions, destroyed 197 Japanese aircraft confirmed, probably destroyed 34 more, damaged 157 aircraft on the ground, lost 19 pilots killed in action or captured, lost 32 aircraft, many to ground fire. Boyington personally scored 22 victories with VMF-214, adding to his 6 with Flying Tigers for 28 total, making him the Marine Corps' leading ace. Boyington's tactics. We'd patrol at 25,000 feet over Rabaul, waiting for Japanese to come up. They had to defend the base, so they had to climb to our altitude. We'd watch them climbing, struggling to reach us. Once they got close, we'd dive at full throttle. The Corsair could hit 450 miles per hour in a dive. We'd come down like thunderbolts, fire one burst, zoom back up. The Japanese couldn't follow. They'd try to turn fight, but we wouldn't turn with them. We'd climb back up using that big Pratt and Whitney engine, then come down again. They couldn't escape by going up. We'd beat them to altitude. They couldn't escape by going down. We were faster. The Corsair made us untouchable. As long as you kept your speed up and didn't try to turn fight, you were safe. Boyington was shot down January 3, 1944, by ground fire during low-altitude strafing, proving the dangers of low-altitude operations. He survived and spent the rest of the war in a POW camp. His squadron continued operations under other commanders, maintaining aggressive tactics and high kill ratios through war's end. By 1944, Japanese engineers understood they needed fighters competing with the Corsair at high altitude. The Korean War from 1950 to 1953 saw Corsairs flying ground attack missions against North Korean and Chinese forces. By this time, jet fighters dominated air-to-air combat, but Corsairs excelled at close air support. Marine and Navy Corsair squadrons flew 80,000-plus combat sorties, demonstrating the aircraft's versatility and durability. Corsairs destroyed more ground targets in Korea than any other aircraft type. The R-2800 engine's reliability and power made the Corsair ideal for carrying heavy bomb and rocket loads, with some variants carrying up to 4,000 pounds of ordnance, double the Zero's entire empty weight. The final combat use of Corsairs came during the soccer war between Honduras and El Salvador in 1969. Both nations operated ex-U.S. military F4U and F4U variants. These aircraft, 25-plus years old, flew combat missions against each other in history's last piston fighter dogfights. The Corsair's reliability meant airframes built in the 1940s remained combat-capable in the 1960s. Technical specifications comparison reveals why the Corsair dominated. 0A6 M5. Engine Nakajima Sakai 21. 1,130 horsepower. Empty weight 4,136 pounds. Loaded weight 6,025 pounds. Max speed 351 miles per hour. Range 1,200 miles. Service ceiling 38,520 feet. Rate of climb 3,150 feet per minute. Wing loading 26.9 pounds per square foot. Power to weight 0.188 horsepower per pound. Corsair F4U engine Pratt and Whitney R2-8008W 2,000 horsepower. Empty weight 8,982 pounds. Loaded weight 14,000 pounds. Max speed 417 miles per hour. Range 1,005 miles. Service ceiling 37,000 feet. Rate of climb 2,890 feet per minute. Wing loading 38.2 pounds per square foot. Power to weight 0.143 horsepower per pound. The numbers show the trade-offs. The Zero had better power to weight at sea level, lower wing loading, better range, and slightly better service ceiling. The Corsair had vastly more absolute power, much higher maximum speed, better armament, armor protection, and critically, maintained power at altitude where the Zero's engine gasped. The Zero optimized for performance through weight reduction. The Corsair optimized for capability through power multiplication. Script 2. Japanese pilots laughed at the crude American Corsair until its 2,000 horsepower engine outclimbed Zero's by 3,000 feet. In air combat, the Corsair's advantages outweighed the Zero's. Speed allowed initiative. The Corsair pilot chose when and where to fight. Climb rate at altitude allowed vertical maneuvering the Zero couldn't match. Armor and self-sealing tanks meant Corsair pilots survived hits that would kill Zero pilots. Heavy armament, 6.50 caliber M2 Brownings with 2,400 total rounds versus the Zero's two 20mm cannons with 120 rounds and two 7.7mm machine guns with 1,400 rounds, meant Corsairs destroyed targets with short bursts while Zeros required sustained fire. The psychological impact of facing an enemy with overwhelming climb performance cannot be overstated. Japanese pilots trained in tactics, assuming they controlled the vertical dimension. The Zero's climb rate had been its greatest advantage against Chinese, British, and early American fighters. Suddenly facing an enemy that outclimbed them by 100% at fighting altitudes shattered this assumption. Pilots who'd survived through superior climbing ability found their primary survival skill negated. The confidence that came from flying the world's best climbing fighter for 3 years evaporated when Corsairs appeared. American pilots gained corresponding confidence. They knew they could outclimb any Japanese fighter. They knew they could disengage at will by climbing away. They knew altitude advantage was theirs for the taking. This confidence translated into aggressive tactics that maximized the Corsairs' strengths. Pilots took risks they couldn't take in Wildcats or Buffaloes because the Corsairs' performance gave them escape options. The production numbers tell the strategic story. Total Corsair production, 1942 to 1953, 12,571 aircraft. Vought built 4,711, Goodyear built 4,007 as FG-1, Brewster built 735 as F3A-1 before contract cancellation. Total zero production, 1940 to 1945, 10,939 aircraft. Japan produced fewer Zeros over 5 years than America produced Corsairs over similar time frame, despite the Zero being cheaper and simpler to build. American industrial capacity allowed simultaneous production of Corsairs, Hellcats, Wildcats, and other types, while Japan struggled to maintain Zero production rates. The cost differential was significant. A Zero cost approximately 120,000 yen in 1944, roughly $12,000 at exchange rates. A Corsair cost $45,000 in 1944. The Corsair cost nearly 4 times more, but delivered vastly more capability. This reflected different economic philosophies. Japan built affordable fighters in quantity. America built capable fighters in quantity. When America could afford expensive high-capability aircraft in large numbers, Japan's cost advantage became irrelevant. The Corsair proved that power-to-weight ratio, particularly power at altitude, was the decisive factor in fighter performance for propeller aircraft. Maneuverability mattered, but only if you could force the enemy into maneuvering combat. Speed and climb rate allowed pilots to choose engagement conditions. The Corsair pilot could force combat at altitudes where his advantages were maximum. The Zero pilot could only accept combat on American terms or refuse combat entirely, neither leading to victory. Modern fighter design validates this principle. The F-15 Eagle's dominant feature is thrust-to-weight ratio exceeding 1-to-1, allowing sustained vertical climbs and energy advantages over adversaries. The F-22 Raptor combines stealth with supercruise and thrust vectoring, maintaining energy advantages in all combat regimes. The emphasis remains on power and vertical maneuverability, direct descendants of lessons learned when Corsairs outclimbed Zeros by 3,000 feet. On that April morning in 1945, when Lieutenant Kanayoshi Muto watched Corsairs climb vertically past his stalling Zero, he witnessed the death of Japanese naval aviation's founding principle, that minimalist design and maximum agility could overcome heavier, more powerful opponents. The principle worked against Chinese I-15 and I-16. It worked against British Buffaloes and Hurricanes. It worked against early American Wildcats. It failed completely against an enemy that multiplied power instead of minimizing weight. The Americans hadn't built a better Zero. They'd built something that made the Zero's advantages irrelevant. When your enemy outclimbs you by 100% at fighting altitude, your superior turn rate doesn't matter because you can't force him into a turning fight. When your enemy can dive away at 450 miles per hour and you can barely reach 380 miles per hour, you can't pursue. When your enemy can climb back to 30,000 feet in minutes while you struggle to reach 25,000 feet, you can't regain altitude advantage. The Zero's design philosophy, performance through weight reduction, reached its logical limit against an opponent willing to accept weight penalties for overwhelming power. The Corsair's 2,000 horsepower R2800 engine, spinning a 13-foot propeller, generated thrust that no amount of weight reduction could match. Japanese pilots learned this lesson in the worst possible way, by dying. 16 Zeros engaged 8 Corsairs on April 7, 1945. 12 Zeros were destroyed. 0 Corsairs were lost. The mathematics were brutal and unchangeable. 3 times the power at altitude meant twice the climb rate, meant altitude dominance, meant attacking from above, meant killing the enemy before he could respond. The Corsair didn't win through slight advantages accumulated carefully. It won through overwhelming superiority in the dimension that mattered most: vertical performance. The bent-wing bird with the whistling death sound climbed into history as the most successful American fighter of World War II, killing 11.3 enemy aircraft for every Corsair lost. The Zero pilots never knew what killed them until it was too late. They flew by 1940 principles into 1945 reality. The gap between those 2 points was measured in horsepower. 2,000 horsepower, to be precise. And those 2,000 horses carried American pilots to altitudes Japanese fighters could never reach, creating kill zones where physics itself fought for the Americans. Kanayoshi Muto's last thought, how, was answered by engineering, not courage. The Americans had built an engine that defied the weight performance compromises everyone else accepted. They'd built it into an airframe that could handle the power. They'd produced 12,571 of them, and they'd sent them to kill every Japanese fighter that dared climb into their sky. The Japanese never found an answer to 2,000 horsepower. By the time they developed fighters that could compete, the war was lost. The Corsair had climbed too high, too fast, for too long. The Zero's reign as the Pacific's dominant fighter ended not in a dramatic reversal, but in a simple, brutal fact. When your enemy climbs 3,000 feet higher in the same amount of time, you're fighting from below. And fighting from below means dying from above. The bent-wing bird made sure of that.